Hi there, everybody. I'm going to start off with just a couple of influences. So the main theme that tends to run through the work that I find the most compelling is that there's some sort of narrative element to it. A Polish artist whose name I'm about to totally butcher, Zdzisław Beksinski, he's quoted as saying, "I react strongly to images that have no obvious answer to their mysteries." When I was preparing this part of this presentation, I came across this quote, and I thought that it was a much more graceful way of saying what I wanted to say here than anything I was likely to come up with, so I figured I would just say that. This is some of Beksinski's work, which is incredibly detailed and precise, though often with this sort of breathy softness around the edges. And I really admire his ability to float these areas of hard, sharp focus amidst these wispy, sort of feathered out surroundings. And I think it makes for extremely immersive images. So I'm interested in narrative. More specifically, I'm interested in narratives that take place in what you might call a different reality or a different world. And there is often a dark or post-apocalyptic flavor to them as well. These are the last 3 in a 5-part series of paintings by Thomas Cole, a pretty classic series, where he just shows the stages of development and eventual destruction of this society. You can see the same mountain peak repeated in the background of each image, just kind of letting us know that it's the same place in each scene. So this series had a big impact on me early on. I was just kind of overwhelmed, I think, by the scope of it. So I'm fascinated by things that explore like the unstoppable forward march of time, kind of the eventual dismantling of everything that we know. And I think that this fascination, that it really stems from my reaction to the state of the world, and just humanity as a whole. Basically that we, as a species, are just not really living up to our potential. That we are capable of amazing things, but not able to control ourselves when it comes to their use. It's really a limiting trait, I think, especially when it comes to us being able to work together to create, a better world that we could all actually be proud of. So it's a very frustrating thing to think about, and it definitely causes me to feel a significant sense of disillusionment with the world and also my place in it. I'm also really into astronomy. So I love to learn about like the life cycles of stars and how fusion works and the other planets in the solar system and stuff like that. And I think one of the most interesting things about this subject is that you discover pretty quickly that we don't actually know how anything works at all. And by we, I mean like physicists, the smartest people who actually study this stuff. Even the things that we think of as scientific fact, like gravity or electromagnetism, they don't really have any idea what those things are or why they exist. We can observe them, we know that they are happening, but as far as why they're happening, it might as well be magic. Then there are also the pictures of outer space, which, of course, are incredibly beautiful. I think they're also kind of impossible to comprehend in any real way. So some of you may be familiar with the Hubble Deep Field images, but if you're not, back in the mid-90s, NASA pointed the Hubble Space Telescope at this really tiny point in the sky, close to the Big Dipper. It's a point like the size of the head of a pin or something like that from our point of view. So they pointed the camera at that one spot and they took this single continuous image for almost 11 solid days. Nobody really knew quite what to expect, because they hadn't ever attempted to take an image like that before. But what they ended up getting back was this. So those are galaxies. Pretty much every one of them, at least as big as our own, and a lot of them even bigger. They've since repeated this experiment several times in different parts of the sky, always with similar results, meaning that the entire universe looks like this. And I think that there's really no adequate way to express just how minuscule we are in a context like this. And I really see this as basically undeniable proof of our insignificance. And it's maybe the ultimate sublime concept. So this is a painting series that I made back in 2006, which was at the very tail end of my time as a BFA student at the University of Memphis. And it's probably the oldest work I have that I still feel a strong sense of connection to. So they're meant to convey, a pretty straightforward narrative, basically just depicting the rise and fall of a civilization and showing the same place at 3 different sequential moments with an unspecified amount of time in between. Really just expressing the attraction I have to that idea that nothing lasts forever. So I find myself heavily affected by narrative, and I'm really just enamored of its ability to make you feel as if you actually experienced something, no matter how fantastical or impossible. And it has the ability, I think, to inspire genuine emotion. And I think that my interest in all of these things that I've been talking about, post-apocalyptic narrative, the passage of time, the insane vastness of the universe, I think they basically all come back to the fact that our existence is just incredibly abstract, and reality is so completely ridiculous so much of the time. I think it can be difficult to find meaning in all of that. So I think what these interests really offer me is both a means of escape from reality, as well as a somewhat comforting reminder of the fact that it's all temporary anyway. But nonetheless, when I do get to thinking about all that stuff, as I often do, just the incomprehensible strangeness of existence, it also inspires in me a pretty much overwhelming desire to just organize everything, just as much as I possibly can, and essentially to exert what limited control that is available to me over my environment. So I do tend to be a very organized person. I spend a lot of time trying to categorize things, sort of line them up in some kind of logical order. It's really a pervasive theme throughout my life, and my work is definitely no exception. So I'm going to quickly show just a couple of the sculptures that I made in undergrad, because I was concentrated in sculpture. Now, unlike that painting series I just showed, I can't say that I really feel a strong sense of connection to this work anymore, mostly because it doesn't relate in any way to that stuff that I was just talking about. And I really tried during this time to connect to these things to some kind of deeper meaning. But in the end, looking back now, I think that they were really just about me learning to manipulate the material with greater dexterity. That they're really just explorations of color and form. So during this time I was working pretty much exclusively with wood and really just refining this particular process. Now, after I got my BFA, I got a job at a custom glass furniture company in Memphis. And it was my primary job there to create custom artwork based on whatever the customers wanted, and then to use this really large and powerful sandblaster to actually carve the images 3-dimensionally into the backside of the glass. So it creates this kind of reverse relief that looks like a positive relief when you view it from the other side. And eventually I also started using that sort of an extension of that process to make sculptures as well. So I think of these as really being a part of that same body of work that I was making in undergrad. And I would definitely say that my growth as an artist, conceptually speaking, really stagnated during this time. And I found that it was just difficult to continue that kind of development outside of the school environment. On the technical side, though, I gained a huge amount of knowledge and ability from this job. And I think that a really important part of that was the fact that working with glass is all about precision, even perfection, because as a medium, glass just makes it really difficult to hide mistakes or even to deal with them. And also the visibility in that sandblaster was extremely poor. So if you didn't know pretty much exactly what you needed to do before you went in there, you were not very likely to get it done. So one of the ways that I dealt with that was by planning things out very carefully, and I started to make these really detailed like numberings and instructions for myself to follow while I was in there working. So that kind of planning ended up becoming a really important part of my process. And it's one that I actually enjoy quite a lot, and I still use it. But after a few years at the glass company, I was really just ready to move on. And honestly, I was just dying to get out of the real world and back into academia, which is a much nicer environment. So this image is a composite of the various drawings and plans that I used to make the first sculpture that I made as a graduate student. I ended up at a place called Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. And they have a really fantastic fine arts graduate program there, and it's heavily focused on three-dimensional work and processes. So this is that first piece completed. It's definitely a much more complex and involved version of the previous pieces that I had made in the same vein. And it had been a few years since I had worked with wood at this point, and I found that the level of finish that I expected from myself was quite a lot higher than what I had expected in the past. And basically, I just discovered that it just wasn't smooth enough until it was really, really smooth. And it was interesting to me because my older work had visible wood grain and imperfections all over the place. It hadn't really bothered me back then. But I think that might have had something to do with the fact that I was used to working with glass, which is so shiny and smooth. But the result of making it so complicated and so smooth was that it was painfully slow to produce. And I ended up spending several months on just this piece. And by the time I was done with it, I really just felt like I was ready to move on. I was basically just done with this idea. And I felt like I had taken it pretty much as far as I was going to. And also, I had spent a lot of time thinking during the making of this piece about why I was making it, what it was that I was really doing with this work. And just kind of finally facing up to the fact that this was never going to be anything more than formalism. And that's not to suggest that there's anything wrong with formalism in a general sense, but just that it was not what I wanted from my work. And that this was never going to directly reference the ideas that I wanted it to. So after that, I did what I think any good graduate student would do. I entered a transitional phase, which kind of started off with this drawing. Now I'm going to get back to this in just a moment, but first I want to talk just a little bit about iron casting. So every semester at SIU they did an iron pour. If you're not familiar with the process, casting iron is a somewhat more difficult and involved process than casting more common metals like aluminum or bronze. Mostly it's because of the extremely high temperatures that have to be reached in order to melt iron. So you need different equipment in order to do it, and also, which you can see some of right there. And you also need at least like 6 or 7 people, and usually more, like 20 or so, all working together in order to make it happen. So it's really a camaraderie building experience, and it's cool too because you're basically pouring lava into stuff. So it's a lot of fun, and it's something that I got really interested in while I was there. I ended up doing quite a lot of it. And instead of making that piece that I just showed the drawing for out of wood, which I had originally intended to do, I ended up making a quarter-scale model of it and casting it in iron. So this was really like a turning point for me, because seeing this piece in metal, it was just so different and so much more interesting, I thought, than what I had originally intended for it to be. It just felt so full of potential to me, like it could be something that had meaning behind it. Like it could be something with its own story, basically. So I started to develop this kind of storyline behind it, where it was this like enormous, ancient monument out in the middle of nowhere, and you'd have no idea why it was there, and just see it for miles around. I realize, of course, that it doesn't actually come across that way at all, because there's no effective context clues in the piece. But that's okay, because the point is that it got me thinking about making things that did have context clues, making stuff that looked like something. And that was a really exciting idea. So this piece, it's mahogany, I made this during the same time that I was making that iron piece. And I think of this one as like a transitional piece as well, but only really in the aesthetic sense. Because I set out with this piece to make something that was, not really dissimilar from the other line-based pieces that I had made before, even though I really wanted to showcase the wood grain for once, instead of trying to hide it, which I usually do. But I think just because of the work I was doing with metal, and learning new materials, and just the way that my thoughts were changing about my work in general, it ended up being a lot more angular and faceted than those previous pieces, which stylistically is a lot more closely related to what I ended up doing next, which turned out to be my thesis show. So this is the postcard that I made for my MFA exhibition, which does not contain any images of the actual work from the show, because none of them were done yet when I was making the card. So I used these drawings that relate to work in the show. Now I'm actually going to skip way ahead right now and just talk about a couple of the things I've been doing since graduate school, so that I can come back and spend the last part of my time talking about this show as a whole. So since I got my MFA, things have been a little bit chaotic for me. I've moved around the country a couple of times. I've also changed jobs a couple of times. But pretty soon after graduating, I ended up getting a job at this place called Bruce Fox, Inc. It's just outside of Louisville, Kentucky, where they make NASCAR trophies and stuff like that, like these, and they make all kinds of different custom awards and trophies and all kinds of random objects. It was different all the time, really. So these are not examples of my work, but they are examples of things that I made while I worked there. Now, I worked in what was called the fabrication department. So it was our primary job to make things like this, the more complicated and intricate awards. These are both probably 5 feet tall. And it was also our job to figure out how to make stuff like this initially, like when things were brand new ideas. So I ended up spending a lot of time making jigs like the ones that you see here. And really, most of my job was about problem solving. And there was quite a lot of detailed craftsmanship and that sort of thing as well, which definitely suited me. But one of the best things about this job was that there was an enormous amount of scrap metal available. So this is just the brass bin, but there was an aluminum one right next to it. And they were both full all the time, and I was actually allowed to use that stuff to make whatever I wanted. So I did. I made all kinds of random around-the-house stuff. I made hooks and flower pots and a bracket to hang my TV on the wall. I also made this tapping machine. I think that this was the first time I ever made something that had moving parts and was also functional. And this thing has actually solved all kinds of problems for me and just made the process of tapping so much easier and faster. And I think it ended up being almost as much a sculpture as it is a tool, even though that was definitely not my intention when I was making it. But it also works great, and I use it all the time. Now, on the subject of tapping, this is a piece that required a huge amount of tap and die work. Tap and die, if you're not familiar, it's just the process of cutting threads, usually into metal, but you can use other materials too. Just making it so that you can screw these things together like nuts and bolts, basically. So the main body of the box is 1/4-inch plate aluminum. And the brass pieces are all 1/4-inch plate brass. And all of them are hand cut and sanded. And I decided to leave those mechanical connections visible because I guess I thought it made it a little bit more interesting, sort of like it's telling the story of how it was made. So these are the plans that I used to make it. I had to be really specific, with the placement of all the holes and the angles of all the pieces, just to get everything to line up properly and to go together. I also ended up making the hinges on this, which was another learning experience, because I really wanted them to be square when the lid was closed. I just wanted them to be like a cohesive part of the object and not something that was going to be visually distracting. And I also wanted to come up with a cool way to open it, that might not be readily apparent to a person who is approaching this thing for the first time. So that's the latch there, and that little circle of slightly darker silver metal, that's a little piece of steel, so it's threaded in there because you can't solder anything to aluminum, which is one of the challenging things about working with it. But it sticks out on the other side of the latch and into a hole inside of the box that contains this really strong little magnet. And just because of the way that this is all situated and the size of it, it's basically impossible to get a good enough hold on that little brass arm of the latch in order to break that magnetic connection. So in order to open the box, you have to turn it around and unscrew that little brass cube there in the back corner. And once you get that guy out, you can screw it into the threaded hole on the front of the latch, which allows you to pull it open. So the inside of the box, it always kind of surprises me when I see it. And I actually had an incredibly difficult time getting that color to happen in there. But I was really happy with the way that that turned out, and I feel like the color just kind of spills out, sort of reflects off itself. Okay, so now back to the Wasteland. So as I said, this was my MFA thesis show, but I have continued to develop it and add to it since then. And I've also had the chance to install it 2 other times since my thesis show. Most recently, just a couple months before I moved here in Louisville, Kentucky. And this work has been extremely important to me because with it, really for the first time, I've been able to express with my 3-dimensional work some of those ideas that I was talking about at the beginning of this presentation, and which before graduate school I had really only been able to hint at through my 2D work, like that painting series that I showed first. So this is an installation view of the show. Now I started working on these pieces sometime during the summer after my first year of graduate school, and I spent the whole rest of my time there working on this. So of course I didn't actually know what it was when I started on it, but I did end up spending 2 solid years completing just these 6 pieces. So the show has this really specific lighting situation happening. It's an extremely important part of the overall idea, but it does present some challenges when it comes to photographing the show. So I realized that it might not be immediately clear to you exactly what's going on here, but I'm going to go through each of the pieces, so hopefully it'll make a bit more sense by the end. So this work ended up being really complex. There are a lot of rules involved in it for me about things like what the different materials and forms mean in the context of the show, and the specific order in which the pieces have to be laid out, and stuff like that. Now, the idea behind this show was largely inspired by a part in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, which has for a long time been one of my favorite books. And I've always been particularly enthralled by this one scene where the time traveler, and who has gone like 800,000 years into the future or something like that, he's doing some exploring in the woods, and he comes across this enormous ruined structure, which turns out to be a museum, or the remains of a museum. And it contains all these strange and unknown objects, machines and other technology. And as he moves across the room examining them, they become increasingly degraded and strange, and more difficult to understand. And for some reason, that particular idea, the idea of exploring a ruinous museum that was set up by a culture that was simultaneously far advanced in comparison to our own, and also long ago erased from the world, is incredibly exciting to me. It's something that always stuck with me. So with this body of work, I decided that I was going to create my own version of that idea. So the first piece is this one, and I'm going to talk about them not in the order in which I made them, but in the order that they have to be displayed. So it's kind of like an internally defined order, which is mostly determined by those brightly colored vine things that are growing all over each pedestal. So in a nutshell, this place is a ruinous, ancient future museum. But the idea of it being a museum specifically is not actually all that vital, I think, in terms of the viewer's experience. What I'm really going for here is just a sense of ambiguous mystery, isolation, just the undisturbed leavings of a lost civilization, just sort of quietly falling apart. Because one of the main differences between this work and Wells's idea is that this place is not meant to exist in the future of our world. Instead, it's meant to be a part of just some completely separate reality from our own. And one of the reasons I know that is because the laws of nature and the laws of physics, they seem to operate just a little bit differently there. So the title for this piece, Nothingness, it's called, and it came from a religious debate that I was watching. I think it was Catholics versus atheists. They were talking about the end of the universe, and the atheist debater referred to that as the nothingness that is coming. And that phrase just really resonated with me, stuck in my mind, and it just seemed like a fitting title for this piece. Because with this piece, I was really trying to emphasize that unstoppable movement towards that end, to focus on the deconstruction of these objects, which, must have had meaning and purpose to the people who put them here. So I mentioned that the order of the pieces is determined by the vines. More specifically, it's determined by the age of the vines, which also happens to correlate with their color. So this is the youngest version of the vine that I've made so far. You can see two different parts of the life cycle here. Next piece is Unknown Technology. That title actually came from a video game, and this piece went through a number of incarnations before it ended up like this. But I decided to call it that because I don't actually know what this piece was for within the context of the society that created these objects. So the big gears on this piece are cast iron. Like I said, I ended up doing quite a lot of that at SIU, and there are actually cast iron elements on every pedestal in the show. And one of the things about this show that was really important to me from pretty early on was this lighting situation. Because I really wanted to transform the space, in a way that was, powerful and really comprehensive. And I was basically trying to emulate the effect of sunlight streaming through a broken wall, which I think is, a pretty commonly used atmospheric device when it comes to the scenes depicting the discovery of something ancient or magical or secret. So I had to do a lot of experimenting with the lights, which was, definitely a challenge because I didn't know anything at all about lighting before I did this. I mean, really, I still don't know anything about it. But basically, I just randomly tried out different filters and masks and lenses until I got something that was pretty close, I think, to what I wanted, but still allowed the room to be bright enough that people could actually see the work. Each piece also has an integrated pedestal. And because of these vine things that are growing out of these cracks in the sides of all of them, it's really not possible to display these pieces without their specific pedestals. I really love the effect that created, but it's definitely less fun when it comes to the storage and transportation of this work. So moving on to the third piece, and this is actually the first one that I made. And it was really the jumping off point that ended up inspiring the rest of the show. So this is the fully matured version of the vine. I happen to have a few images of this one in more traditional lighting. And you can see that the form changes quite a bit as they age. It's quite a bit bigger, though generally speaking the form is still mostly the same. And that ball thing on the top of it, which I call a geopod, so it's split open to reveal this hollow interior. The vines have kind of taken advantage of that, just grown all over inside of it. And all the colors have darkened as well, so on the vines, as well as on the interior and exterior of the geopod, everything is darker. So this is the drawing for that piece that I started with. Technically speaking, this piece was really involved to make. And it was way more complex and varied than anything that I had made before, because this was the first one of these that I made. So I have just a couple in progress shots for this piece. Probably the most difficult part was figuring out that many-faceted geopod on the top. So I used that green styrofoam ball that you can see in the top picture that I got at Hobby Lobby. Just with foam core, I figured out, the size and the shape of all the pieces. And I also measured all of the many, many different angles that went into this. So I made each piece as an individual part before assembling them. And this was a process that required considerable precision on my part, because each facet is unique, so every angle is different. I was definitely, pretty proud of myself when I got this thing together. I also spend a truly ridiculous amount of time sanding and filling and painting these things, all the different vine things, just trying to completely erase the material that it was made from. Because I really want these to exist as something that is as absent of real-world associations as possible, basically. I want to get rid of any distracting evidence of its actual reality and its connection to specific things in this world, which means that all of the connection mechanisms and all of the seams have to become completely invisible. Since this thing is made out of like dozens and dozens of individual components, that is definitely a big job. So I end up spending literally hundreds of hours revisiting areas on these things and reworking them over and over again. And it's actually something that I do on pretty much every piece that I make, but it's particularly prevalent in these painted wood pieces. And it's a process that really just drives me crazy, because I know that, at least to some extent, I'm making changes that, nobody other than me would even be able to notice. But it's just sort of a compulsive thing, I guess, because I can't really seem to stop doing it. I would definitely say that it goes back to my need to organize things and control them. So this is a picture of my studio when I was working on some of the vines. And I wanted to show this image because it gives a really nice clear view of the color gradient effect that's happening within each of the vines, but it's also happening across the room as a whole. And that is really the thing that determines the placement of the pedestals. And I think that the gradient effect is particularly noticeable in this vine, which happens to be the one that goes on the next piece I'm going to talk about, Filament it's called. So one of the best things about SIU, where I went to school, was, like I said, the graduate program was heavily focused on three-dimensional materials and processes, and there was a ton of metalworking going on there, which was really great for me because when I got there I knew almost nothing about working with metal at all. And they even have a blacksmithing program, which is actually pretty unique as far as college goes. And they have a really well-equipped blacksmithing shop. So during those last 2 years while I was working on this stuff, I was on this kind of quest to just learn as much as I could about metalworking. So I decided to take blacksmithing as an elective. So the central spike of this piece I forged from 2-inch by 2-inch solid steel square stock. It was about 2 feet long, so we're talking about a serious chunk of steel. And to do this, I used this massive pneumatic power hammer that they had there. It's really an industrial caliber machine, not the kind of thing you normally find in a school. But it does exactly what you might think a power hammer would do. It basically just smashes like a big block of steel down onto another big block of steel kind of like a hammer hitting an anvil, but you know, with enough power behind it to actually shape something of this size. And using that thing was seriously intense. Really, just the force that that machine came down with is unlike anything else that I've experienced. So that was really, really cool. The thin geometric shapes that you can see on this piece, kind of coming off of the main form, those are also steel, and they are inlaid with lots of little brass lines and held onto the main form with magnets. Magnets, I think, are really one of the greatest things about working with steel, is they're kind of you know, the ultimate temporary attachment mechanism. So I mentioned a while back that there are a lot of rules associated with this work. And by that, I'm referring to this sort of narrative backstory that I came up with to help me make cohesive decisions about these objects. So it defines things like, you know, the particular meaning or use of certain repeated forms and materials within the context of this place. So for a lot of these objects, I actually do have some idea of what their specific purpose was. This one was the inside of a light bulb, a really big light bulb, like a street light. So piece number 5. Now that narrative that I mentioned, it also defines the relevance of the vines and the geopods, because they actually have a really important relationship to this society. And there's actually quite a lot to that. It's not actually written out in like one cohesive document or anything. Really, calling it a narrative might be a little bit generous. It's basically just a bunch of notes and drawings and like a random paragraph here or there. So you can see how red the vines are by this point in the room. Just working on that gradient. I also have a few images of this piece with gallery lighting, even though the finish on the metal as it's shown here is pretty different from the way that it actually ended up. But the bigger pieces on the top of this thing are more cast iron, and the little gears that you may be able to see inside are fabricated steel and brass, and the hexagonal stand thing is forged steel. So anyway, I decided to create those narrative elements because I realized at some point that if I wanted these objects to feel connected, you know, if I wanted them to come across as being a part of something bigger, that I was going to have to understand them from the kind of internal point of view of this place that I was creating. So I needed the rules, but I think that the ambiguity of these objects, it's really important to the overall idea. So it's definitely not my intention to convey the specifics of that story through the work, or really at all. So the last piece is that one, which is the oldest vine so far that I've made. And the whole thing is quite a bit bigger than its middle-aged orange version. It's also proportionately skinnier, it has sharper angles. You can see that the whole thing has sort of started to slump down, spread out. It has like a less proud kind of posture to it than the other ones. And you may be able to decipher that one of the arms has completely unraveled and has dropped its section of the geopod onto the pedestal. So this is the drawing that I used to make that piece. And when I make these things, I usually scan and print out a full-size version of the drawing, basically a version of the drawing at the size that I want the sculpture to be. But other than that, I really just eyeball the translation from 2 to 3 dimensions. So I'm often really surprised by how much they actually end up looking like the drawings. I have a couple in-progress shots for this one too. And this one definitely presented a number of new structural difficulties because it was a lot more spindly and delicate than the other ones. There's also colors on the inside of the geopods that change as they age. And those few facets on those pieces are the only place in the entire show where I use any cool colors at all. But you can see in this image up in the corners that little bit of purple, which takes up maybe 8 square inches of the entire show, but I swear I spent a week mixing that purple. I just needed it to be like just the right purple. Because to me, the perfect balance within each color is extremely important. So you can see all 19 of the oranges that I used for the show here all lined up. And I really enjoy things like this, enjoy creating these colors, finding just the perfect version of it. I think it's just the visual organization of colors that they allow that I just find it very satisfying. So that covers the whole show. I think you can see in this image the way that the color moves across the room. And I hope that at least the most overt statement that I'm making here is pretty clear. Simply that things fall apart, that we are temporary. And also that we both as a species and as individuals need to start actually thinking about that. And to realize, just how precarious our position here actually is. Because we're not entitled to our existence, and we just happen to have it for the moment. And it's really not a question of if this will eventually be the state of our society. And it's only a question of when. And, even though I am fascinated by make-believe versions of it, I have no actual desire to see the end of the world. But there are definitely times when I look at us, I can't help but find it just a little bit comforting to know that eventually it will end and something different will happen. But really, that's a beautiful concept, I think, because not only does it imply that there are truly endless possibilities in the universe, this constant, never-ending cycle of just beginnings and endings, but to me, at least, it means, without question, that it's not about us. The universe isn't for us. And I think that that is a really good thing, because if it was, it would just be kind of sad and a waste. And the mystery of it all, I think, the abstract craziness of existence, it's way more fun anyway. And that's all I have.